Thanks, Greg. That was great. I don't know about you guys, but it's really important, I think, that we hear the story from the local people. I think it gives it more flavour, more colour, and it certainly is more passionate than if I sort of related it to you. However, we don't have time to hear from at least 60 different case studies from across Australia. So what I'm going to do now is give you a bit of a snapshot of the sorts of information that we've found by trying to contact as many people as we can about social infrastructure projects in regional Australia. So earlier this year, RAI went out and did an online survey and then followed up with interviews and case studies across Australia. We got 160 respondents, ranging from Christmas Island down to the bottom end of Tasmania. Some exciting place that I'd never heard of. But what this is showing you is we got a really nice breadth and interest across a range of different areas. The respondents for the survey were split almost half for the local government areas, so workers from that sort of side. But interestingly, you can see that many of the respondents of the survey also came from private sector and other. Does anyone have an idea what other might mean? I was thrilled by other, because other to me was all those people we'd never thought about before. So they're the consultants, they're the, they're the non-government organisations that do lots of service delivery that in the normal way that people think about social infrastructure are sometimes sidelined. So for me, I think other is perhaps some of our more interesting areas. Now the survey is interesting because that and the interviews really tried to give us an understanding of what regional Australia think about what is social infrastructure, who is involved in social infrastructure, and the types of social infrastructure projects that are funded, how they're measured, and what are some of the challenges that they might come across when they're actually being delivered as well. And so with that in mind, I'm going to run through some of these results, just so you can put Greg's project in context, because we will certainly be reiterating some of the things that he's raised, and also for Ursula's project, you can see where that sort of fits in the broader picture of what's happening in regional Australia. So let's have a look. Firstly, what is social infrastructure to you? Typically, as you would think, social infrastructure, when we ask people, really focused on those structures. What are the physical bricks and mortar assets that people are using? And they talked about childcare centres, community centres, health centres, hospitals, rec parks, all the things that you would expect, which is really nice. So the majority of respondents identified this. However, more than half the respondents identified a range of services that were also critically important to what the package of social infrastructure is. So these services were things like job seeker services, legal aid, the NBN. I didn't know if that was an asset or a service, but anyway, universities and police services, those sorts of things. And then there was another group, which was a smaller group, that actually had a more perhaps a more economic focus to what they thought social infrastructure was. And that included business incubators, postal services, technology parks, shopping centres, that type of thing. But I guess what I'm showing is that everyone relates to the physical assets, and then less people relate to those community service sort of delivery aspects. And then there's even a smaller group that really tie on to those economic sort of catalysts, I guess, that really deliver to regional economic development. Interesting, no one really identified that those processes that I talked about first up were part of the social infrastructure mandate, what they thought it included. Now this could be because we didn't explicitly ask about it, or maybe they thought that this was something that's inherent and would obviously come if you had good service delivery and great asset management. So, but it was interesting that it wasn't highlighted. The next type of question we wanted to know is, who is a social infrastructure practitioner? It's really hard to engage on a topic if you don't know who you're talking to. So we thought we'd better get a really clear handle on who actually works in social infrastructure. In general, the sky is the limit, I think, is one of the nice quotes that I like from this sort of thing. There is no one that wasn't involved in social infrastructure, from volunteer groups, community services, CEOs of councils. People also argued all the way up to MPs and the Prime Minister. Everyone is involved in social infrastructure. Makes your job a bit hard to try and contact them though, doesn't it, if you have to contact everyone. But they also said that maybe there are some core groups of people that we could target, and they are related to the community, health and education sort of portfolios. And they cut across those portfolios. But as you see here, it's about our community development officers, our economic development officers, our frontline medical staff that we see, our teachers, librarians, as well as our childcare and youth care workers. But critical to that was also the non-government organisations and the government organisations that are sometimes the key providers of these people within our society. It was interesting, though, that there was a minority of people that sort of highlighted that there is no single social infrastructure practitioner, but that social infrastructure is incorporated across such a variety of roles and portfolios that you almost need to go in project-specific or topic-specific. Otherwise, you will get too many people involved. It was also noted that there was a couple of respondents that said, you know what, all of those community development officers and economic development officers are a waste of time. You should go to frontline service delivery, teachers, health professionals. They're the people that really make social infrastructure work. I think this reflects the fact that social infrastructure on the ground is seen as services, and social infrastructure and planning is seen more in that asset sort of in that structural light. And maybe the idea that social infrastructure is our processes that we engage in the community is just an underlying given. But everyone is involved in that as well. So I guess I thought that this was quite interesting because it shows us that there's lots of people engaged in social infrastructure in our local areas. We also want to ask about the type of projects. We've heard that it crosses many portfolios. Greg's given us a really nice example about how a rec centre can suddenly morph into community sort of hub. It can change into providing jobs. There's a whole range of things that it can do. When we were looking at the projects that we found, we thought that they fitted nicely along our continuum from reducing risk to capturing opportunity. And some of the projects, just as an example, were things like the new St John Ambulance Sub-Centre in Broome. This wasn't about delivering new services. It wasn't even about upgrading the facilities they had in any significant way. This was about making compliant what was necessary. So it was almost a replacing new for old because it was a service that was required. We move through and we see that things like the Blackall Childcare Centre had been called on for the last 20 years and has only just opened with much excitement because these people felt that for their growing community they needed to provide early childhood education, and this released mothers back to work and it also ensured that they had greater retention in their school. So this sort of programs are really about community development in its basic sense and about developing the community and its values for what they are. We then can move through and we see things like improving business ecosystems as reflected in projects such as the Renew Cooma. This is about working with business and customers and locals to actually get projects that revitalise a centre of a community town for the benefit for all. It's not just about bringing in dollars, it's actually about enhancing an identity that's already there. And then the last one we thought that was really exciting or really different was a Innovate Tasmania, which is actually an awards ceremony across Tasmania that celebrates innovative ideas. And they got on board newspapers, local government, federal government, all sorts of players, so that they could really celebrate some of the innovative ideas that are coming out of Tasmania to reinforce that business culture that's about making new things and making things better and different. This is about increasing profitability and spend, but it's really also about enhancing an identity that's squarely within the Tasmanian community that they felt had been lost for a while. Now, each of these different projects can fit mainly into those three aspects of social infrastructure that I mentioned. So there's structures, there's services and processes. It's interesting, I thought, that the ones more focused on the economics were much more down the processes sort of line, about getting people together rather than delivery of a specific or single-only service. But it was very clear that each of these different projects actually had to do a mix of almost all three of them to make it happen. It's just about which one was more prevalent. Now, for those projects, and I think Greg really reinforced it quite nicely with his example, the key thing that we got when we were talking to people was funding. How did they get their project funded? Why did they get their project funded? how could they do it again so they would get their project funded? Now, we're not recommending any specific funding model, but I can relate to you what are the insights that we've got. So firstly, we found that for many projects, it was really about identifying a clear community need and aligning that need with the whole community and all the players there, as well as to the specific funding bodies that you want. So the more successful projects had a clear community need that looked at the future growth of communities, what they would need there, that also looked into the different funding models and how they could deliver benefits for everyone. They also had a really strong local capacity. And Greg mentioned that he talked about the leadership of the bowling club and how it had changed so it reflected the skills required at the time. And I think this is important because there's been a number of projects that we found that because they got people that were burnt out or that didn't have the skills or capacity necessary to manage it, their social infrastructure project went nowhere. And some of them were even funded to what they wanted, but they couldn't get it on the ground and moving. The next thing that was really clear, and I'll jump to the end, is about that there has to be a rationale for investment. So if you go back, we talked about that it's either about reducing risk or seeking opportunity, but as long as you're clear about your rationale for investment, then people are really willing to buy in and fund it. So you need to be very clear from the beginning. It's not always just about social benefit, and if it is, you need to make that clear and articulate. But the projects not feasible without funding assistance had to seek a huge array of funding. Jeff mentioned that they have a one-third policy, which is a really nice way of articulating that. Not many councils that we talk to actually had that clear sort of structure in their funding. So what they did was they sought funding ad hoc when it was appropriate. Interesting, any project that was of significant size, I'd say over about $500,000, they almost needed all of them. They started from the local level and they needed local, state and federal. I don't think we saw any big project that didn't have all three of those lined up. So it's not about finding one funding body, it's finding multiple packages of funding that you can actually align to your project. Interesting, when we look at the local funding bodies that they found, that the first start was their philanthropic and family community businesses, and some of these were really quite productive for those smaller projects, particularly about risk minimisation. Then the local government was a key funder in almost every project. I don't think we saw one that they didn't have local government funding or support in some way. But also large companies with local bases, banks, water companies, those sorts of things actually had a whole raft of funds that many small groups didn't know about, and it would be worthwhile for them to be upskilled in where they can seek their funding that align to their local interests and needs. The next group is about state, and we don't have anyone here from the states, so I don't think. Oh, apologies, we have one. And I guess in relation to the states, it's about working out what the package of funding in that's appropriate for you. Almost every state funding was about need alignment. So if you're in the health sector, you go for health funding. If you're in the housing, you go for housing funding. If you're in libraries, you go for library funding. That's how you had to align the funding. It wasn't about aligning generally with regional development, although some of the big projects certainly focus more on the regional development end. And lastly, at the federal level, so that's at the Australian level, we found it really interesting that there was a huge cross-section of funding pools that people had tapped into. So there was the innovation work, there was funding sources that came straight out of PM&C, so that was community development. There was also things like work for the dole that they'd used for their social infrastructure projects, exceptional circumstances, and of course many people had tapped into the National Stronger Regions Fund as well. So that just gives you that there's a huge variety of funding sources, but you need to go back to need alignment, because without need alignment, there was no success. And on that, sometimes you learn more for the projects that weren't successful. And we had some great discussions with people that ran through the reasons why they don't think their project was funded. Of course, this is one-sided. It's not talking to the funding bodies, but this is about why a social infrastructure project didn't get up and going. And the key thing, I think the take-home message for me, was that the project was not shovel-ready. And I like that quote because it means that you've done everything you can to make sure everything's organised. So starting from the top, Some of the reasons why projects were not funded were things like there was a lack of community drive and ownership of it. They also had challenges in coordinating across different parties. This is about the governance arrangements that you have in place. There was a real short-term planning that was implemented so that people weren't thinking into the long term, what is the next generation requiring, how do we get those sort of buy-in. There was also irregular funding schemes and difficult funding criteria. It was very clear, particularly from our survey work, that there's a lot of local governments that do not have the capacity to put in grants successfully at state and federal level. They don't know, they don't understand what the requirements are. They were unclear about how to make a successful bid as opposed to just answer what they thought the questions were. There was also a lack of self-sufficiency. There was a number of social infrastructure projects that would require support, funding support into the long term. And Jeff mentioned local government is less willing to invest in that, so is everyone. So as long as you've got a long-term vision and self-sufficiency, it really made a difference for the success of your project. So that's about the unfunded projects. And I think we can learn something there because I think this shows up what some of the challenges for the social infrastructure projects on the ground in Australia. Lastly, this is going back to that 4 key steps in actually developing social infrastructure projects. So these are the best practice steps. And one of the things that people always wanted to talk about was what was the benchmark? What was the metric? What should I put in here? Or what do I need to be more successful? And what I thought I'd just do is highlight some of the sort of attributes that have come out through all the different work that we've done. That even at the impact end, if your project is really about risk minimisation, you can see that there are some quantifiable attributes that you can put in. And these were some of the things that made funding more successful. So, for example, proportion of women who return to work versus a pre-training event or activity. On the outputs end, it was much more straightforward. People were much clearer about how many users they were going to get, what sort of decrease in costs this would have, and you saw Jeff had put up those sorts of numbers already for Denmark and for their Riverside Club. So those things are really quite easy, not easy, but there's the sorts of things that are necessary and clear for most projects. In the activity description, that was always qualitative and always passionate. There was not a single one, I think, that we read or that we talked about that you didn't feel that this was not a project that the locals wanted. So that was a really important part of the success of social infrastructure projects in regional Australia. And then lastly, about the inputs, it was really obvious when there was a lack of clarity of leadership or when there was no need alignment, because many of the projects, they were disjointed or people felt that they didn't have the connectivity that made them a successful sort of group of attributes. So this highlights that for each of those 4 steps that there are some clear, some clear keys if people wanted to structure how to make a more successful social infrastructure project. So, I guess what our findings tell us. Firstly, our findings tell us that there's lots of people involved in social infrastructure, and because it cuts across portfolios, it cuts across different interests and local groups, it's almost a really difficult one to put into a clear box and fund per se. It's about using good ideas and principles and applying them across a whole range of different areas. We also found that longevity and good processes, so one of those 3 key things of social infrastructure, were really the underground success for any social infrastructure project that people talked about. And that was success. Not only did it bring an economic benefit, but did it deliver what people wanted in the long term. We also found, and I think those 2 findings, but also the work in general, has identified that there's probably 3 key insights. That basically that there's a lack of really good metrics for assessing social infrastructure impacts, more than just a cost-benefit analysis. And on discussions with Infrastructure Victoria, it became really clear that that's actually one of their key areas that they're investigating at the moment, is how do we measure things, some of them which have a really clear market opportunity, are easier to measure in cost-benefit, but others that are much more about risk reduction are much harder. So what are some of the core metrics that we should be actually putting up or we should be proposing as part of a framework? We also found that there's a need for aligning the rationale of projects with the impacts and funding schemes. If you've got a rationale that's about risk reduction, it's really hard to sell it as an economic project and do a clear cost-benefit analysis. That's not what it's set up to do. So it's about how do we find the right funding that delivers on the right sort of projects. So that's why I think it's important that we think about the rationale for these projects from the beginning. And there's also a need that there were many people that said, oh, because our project was small, we didn't have to do those sort of steps, as in those best practice 4 steps. But I think on talking to people, by actually thinking through those 4 steps, they would get better clarity and they might have more successful projects on the ground. They're just really about good project management. So this is what we think are the 3 key insights that have come from our work in looking at social infrastructure projects across regional Australia. Thanks.